Good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to get going in just a few minutes. We're going to give folks a chance to continue to filter into the webinar here. If you want to identify yourself in the chat window, where you're coming from, if you're associated with a town or organization, anything you like there, we'd love to hear from you and where you're coming from today. And again, we'll get going in just a few minutes. Okay, once again, if you're just joining us today, thanks for coming to our webinar. If you're just coming in, if you want to put your name and where you're coming from today in the chat, as well as maybe who you're associated with, if anybody, we'd love to hear from folks. And I think we're gonna kick things off. So. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining our latest webinar in our Building the New Forest Future series. I'm Mike Morin, Vermont, New Hampshire Program Director at the Northern Forest Center, connecting with you today from Glen, New Hampshire. Today's topic is municipal strategies for managing short-term rentals. I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues here at the Northern Forest Center, including Isabella Ronson, Maura Adams, who are both helping behind the scenes today. Today's session is being recorded, and all links and resources will be shared following the webinar, as well as the recording. Our decision to bring the topic of today's webinar to y'all is rooted in our ongoing efforts to focus on subjects that are relevant and top of mind in communities across the Northern Forest region. News stories about communities tackling the management of short-term rentals, or STRs, as you'll probably hear as shorthand throughout the conversation today, are increasingly common and have been prevalent for several years. So it was well past time that we dove into this topic. Based on the stories in the news and the firsthand experiences of center staff across the region, we know that short-term rentals have become an increasingly hot-button topic, particularly in communities where tourism represents a significant portion of the local economy. The rise in the popularity of STRs has meant that homeowners can explore new and exciting ways to bolster their household income, but it's also meant that investors now see single-family homes and condos as commodities, with real estate listings often touting a home's potential or past earnings as a selling point. The paradigms are vast and not cut and dry, and one community may see STRs as a vehicle for addressing lodging needs, while another may be grappling with concerns related to changing neighborhood dynamics and housing stock scarcity that may be tied to an increasing percentage of homes being converted to short-term rentals. Our own Adam Bailey, the Adirondack Program Manager for the Center, explored these tensions through his Cornell University Master of Regional Planning capstone project in 2022. The report, entitled Municipal Short-Term Rental Policies, Analysis and Recommendations for Adirondack Communities, represents months of detailed research into the prevalence, impact, and management of short-term rentals in the Adirondacks and nationally. You can read the full report or a shorter analysis on our website. The links will be in the chat. Whether acting in a reactive or proactive manner, municipalities are increasingly looking to enact ordinances that manage STRs in some way. Whether through simple registration programs that allow a city or town to monitor the total number of STRs within its boundaries, or by enacting restrictive zoning that establish parameters for how and when a home can be used as an STR, the topic consistently brings forth strong opinions from those for and against policies that seek to manage STRs. Today, we have 4 municipal leaders representing communities in each of our Northern Forest states to share a little bit about the process their towns went through to explore and enact ordinances and what the outcomes have been. I have no doubt that the conversation will generate good questions and likely a few shared examples from our audience today. We're looking forward to the discussion and appreciate the interest. Before we turn to the panel, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to have individual introductions and open remarks from our 4 panelists, and then a panel discussion, followed by some time for Q&A with your questions. You can post your questions at any time. Please post your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat window, as it will help us manage and keep track of them so we can be sure to field all of your questions. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, share resources with the group, etc. So now I'm pleased to be able to introduce our panel. You're going to see a map with where everyone's coming from. And so from west to east, our panelists today are Emily Kilburn Politi, Town Councilor from North Elba, New York; Mike Harris, Zoning Administrator from Burke, Vermont; Peter Gagnon, Town Manager from Gorham, New Hampshire; and Peter Jameson, Town Manager from Millinocket, Maine. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite Emily to come on the screen and share a bit about herself, her town, and a very brief overview about her town's STR regulation.
Mike, I feel like your intro of how to approach short-term rentals and the issue that it's become was great. So great highlight.
Thank you.
So as Mike mentioned, my name is Emily Kilburn Politi, and I'm a second-term council person for the town of North Elba, which is located in northern New York. And for those of you who have never heard of North Elba, I'm not shocked. The village of Lake Placid is probably what you've heard of as the host of the winter 1932 and 1980 Winter Olympic Games, and of course the legendary Miracle on Ice hockey game. And so that's kind of North Elba's claim to fame, is the village of Lake Placid is located within our boundaries, in addition to the village of Saranac Lake. So it's a town with a couple villages within it. Our population is about 8,000 residents, full-time residents. We have a strong seasonal and vacation home economy and housing stock. I did ask our assessor in less than 5 seconds to give me the median price of a single-family home in North Elba, and because if I gave him more than 5 seconds, he would do all this data, and I didn't want him to do it. And he said $475,000 off the lake, and probably more like $4 million on the lake. So that kind of gives you a gauge of what our a traditional house in a neighborhood. The median price is about $475,000. Our economy is primarily tourism and event driven, highlighted in the months of July and August, which we also host an Ironman event, the I Love New York Horse Show, and Summit Lacrosse tournaments, which brings thousands of people to town. And in the past 5 years, New York State has invested significant money in our Olympic venues, which has brought a great resiliency into our winter tourism, because now we can host world-class and international competitions at our winter venues, which were kind of coming into disrepair. So now we're seeing tourism, full year round. We have very small shoulder seasons now. So all of that is great for our economy, but has put a lot of pressure on our housing stock and put a lot of pressure just on accommodations, where people are going to stay. And we do have a very strong hotel and motel market, but as we know, the traveling public has different desires now, and a lot of them prefer to stay in a traditional home setting or an apartment setting. So our evolution of short-term rentals, which Mike has required that I do really quickly, it started in 2017. A working group was formed with a law that eventually was enacted on in 2020. And that law was mostly health and safety, occupancy, parking, things like that, emergency contact person. So March of 2020 was our first, I call it short-term rental 1.0 for the town of North Elba, which also brought in the village of Lake Placid, because we do have a joint land use code. And then in 2023, we enacted a second set of, actually it was a whole new redo of our short-term rental legislation, because we wanted to make it a little bit more restrictive while still seeking that balance of, balancing community character and the need for accommodations. And so we got a little bit tougher on some of our restrictions in 2023. And so that law has been in place for 2 years, and it's been working, we think it's been working very well to reach that balance of community character, accommodations, making sure you're taking care of the traveling public while also protecting neighborhoods.
Great. Thanks for that. Mike Harris, you want to give us an overview from Burke?
Yes, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Emily. I'm Mike Harris. I'm the zoning administrator with the town of Burke. If most people are not familiar with the town of Burke, it's a small resort community. Not like Stowe, Vermont, very much smaller than that. And it's made up of 3 different sections of town: West Burke, Burke Hollow, and East Burke. Burke Mountain Resort is located in East Burke, Vermont. Back before the pandemic, we started seeing an uptick in the short-term rental activity within the town, and a number of different reasons. We started looking at a short-term rental ordinance was to both provide some safety net for some of these properties to ensure that they are in compliance with the state fire marshal's office. What we're trying to basically do is just trying to get a handle on the inventory of rental units that we have within the town. We developed this rental registration ordinance beginning in 2022 and adopted it last year, and implemented it. Basically just looking at a couple of different aspects. One was the fire safety aspect of it. The other one was to make sure that property owners' paperwork was in order in terms of when dealing with transactions of property, whether it was an outright sale and or refinancing of their properties. I began to see more and more requirements from the financial institutions as well as insurance companies looking for proper permit paperwork. This was, so we, or at least I felt pretty strongly that's something needed to be put in place to kind of help guide people to ensure that they were staying in compliance as far as that goes. We've had pretty good success with it. Like I said, we adopted it last year with a slow rollout in terms of getting people to go through a more formal permit process through the town to be able to be able to act in the rental activities, as well as following up with that with the rental registration as well. That's a yearly registration. A couple of different things with that was along with the fire department, fire and safety, and the insurance and financial institutions. Also, by having this rental ordinance in place, it also was a yearly reminder to folks to, if there were changes within that past year in terms of smoke detectors, any changes with the physical property itself, that it was so noted that anything that needed to be updated or corrected was done. And that's pretty much where we're at right now. We're continually getting the word out, continually educating people on the rental registration process and going through the permit process.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Turn it over to Peter Gagnon.
Great. So as Mike said, I'm Peter Gagnon, the town manager here in Gorham. I appreciate the diversity we have here in this board. I'm looking forward to working with this panel quite a bit. For those of you who don't know, Gorham is not Gorham, Maine. A lot of people come, they think Gorham, Maine. It's Gorham, New Hampshire. We're nestled in the White Mountains. We have a community that's been a pretty stable 2,700 person community, and has historically been a tourist economy. We're at the confluence of the Peabody River, Moose River, the Androscoggin River, and of course, Route 2 and Route 16. So we have a long history of being a tourism economy, though we strive to have really an integrated economy. We still have one of the last paper mills on the East Coast that's working here in Gorham. And, our economy includes light industry, timber industry, things of that nature. Our short-term rental program started to perk up with COVID. We're just north of North Conway and Jackson, New Hampshire, which many of you might know. So you come up through the notch, you hit Gorham. There was some real estate pressure that kind of became evident to us in town, and properties started to turn into short-term rentals. So in 2020, we started working on this with the planning board. In 2022, we implemented our short-term rental ordinance. It was really important for the town to have a balancing act, as you've heard from the other speakers. We want to balance property rights. Residents have property rights, investors, but we also have a duty of care to maintain our residential neighborhoods as residential neighborhoods. So we didn't try to control, but more regulate our short-term rentals. And we did this by limiting the number of days that a non-hosted or a non-resident owned property could rent. And so far, we've been fairly successful. Anecdotally, I can tell you we've had a couple properties that folks didn't look at the regulations. They were out of state. They bought property thinking they're going to rent it 200, 250 days a year or more. And they found out that it was limited at 120. So that really minimized their monetization. On the other hand, residents who are seasonal or want to monetize part of their property, 120 days seem to be fine for them. I will point out, as you've heard before, we looked at this as a health and safety issue first. We saw other communities around us have some high profile lawsuits that we weren't really interested in. So through our planning board and getting a lot of public input, we had a pretty diligent process, and the process is ongoing. You'll hear later today some of the challenges and things that will inevitably come up, but that's to be expected. But we started our process thinking of health and safety, and this would be good for obviously the visitors coming up, but ultimately for the property owners themselves. And when you explain things that way, they seem to be more understanding. Currently, Gorham has about 1,300 parcels of property. Some of those are land, but about 1,300. And we have 30-something short-term rentals that we have identified. So it's about 2% of our parcel stock is there. And so far, we've navigated this, always keeping our ears open for public comment. And again, listening to other communities as we have here today. So I look forward to the rest of our meeting.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Peter Jamison.
Hey everyone, I'm Peter Jamison. I'm the town manager in Millinocket, Maine. I have been the town manager here for a little over 3 years. Those of you that aren't from Maine, we're actually smack dab in the middle of the state when you look at a map. But those from away, as we so affectionately refer to them as, can't imagine going any further north. They're familiar with Portland or Augusta, even Bangor, and then they say, why would you live north of there? And it's because it's an incredible place. So outside of about 10 years in my 20s, where I lived between Southern California and other parts of New England, I have lived right here in Millinocket and still do. My family, I'm third generation on my mother's side, fourth generation on my father's. And I raised my family here, and it's a great place to live. That does cause equal amounts of challenge and reward. We are a former paper mill town. Was built and funded entirely by the Great Northern Paper Company. And at our peak in the 80s, we had about 8,000 residents. You know, late 80s into the early 2000s, things started to go downhill with that industry. Lots of layoffs, lots of, closures and reopens. And that caused kind of a mass exodus of people, community members. And in 2014, when that closed for the final time and everybody was gone, it really crashed the housing market. For example, in 2020, I bought a 4-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,200 square foot home for $35,000. And that comes into play in a moment. These days we're hovering around 4,200 people in population, and we do have some really exciting things coming down the pike in terms of economic development. We are a very rural community at the gateway of the great outdoors. Right in our backyard is Mount Katahdin, Baxter State Park, Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, the Penobscot River. We have, we're rapidly becoming more and more well known for outdoor recreation, and that continues to grow. That has been the base of our economy in in recent years. However, there's a lot of serious traction on new industrial development in several renewable and sustainable markets. So, our goal is the common ground between outdoor rec and industry. We thrive for year-round residents, and a little less of the seasonal. Short-term rentals were introduced to Millinocket very quickly by COVID. As a lot of folks were leaving the more congested areas, looking for space and fresh air. The investors, the short-term rental market investors, really swooped in and gobbled up a lot of that cheap housing stock, which, had its benefits. It certainly, they put a lot of work into them. They definitely played into the increase in home values and the rise in the housing market around here. But it also put a serious stronghold on long-term or permanent housing options for people that, needed a place to live here or were trying to move here for a, full-time job. Our local efforts started in, late 2020, 2021, towards short-term rental ordinance and permitting. It was a long and windy road. I think the real barrier would have been, consistent changeover in leadership at all levels. Town manager position switched a couple of times. The boards and committees that we're working on at the council, and there was not one person for the first few years that was really pushing that through and keeping it on track. The main goal for short-term rental regulation here in Millinocket, although there was a housing crunch, it was entirely based on health and safety. Our first responders had several times they had gone to these properties to find out they were short-term rentals and had no idea how to get a hold of the people who owned them. And that's what sparked the conversation here. You know, it's evolved a little since then, but that is still, you know, the major priority of our ordinance is health and safety and you know, life safety code inspection. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And thanks to all of you for that rundown of from where you're from, who you are, and your various ordinances. Everyone kind of gave kind of a varying depth in terms of summaries, and I wanted to just give folks a chance to dive a bit deeper on their respective regulations. You know, consideration, you know, talk a bit about any considerations that your ordinances give to occupied properties versus investment properties or second homes, limitations, other, you know, deeper dive details that folks might be interested in. And Emily, I wanted to give you a chance to dive in there right out of the gates.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that the 2020 ordinance did was we kept hearing from people that, you know, it was like, you need to do something about this, you know, like you need to regulate it. And we'd say, we don't have a definition in our land use code. And so you can't regulate something if it's not defined. At least that was our interpretation, our interpretation. So he said, step one, we got to define this use. Like, what exactly is it? It's not single family use. It's not hotel motel. So we came up with a definition that is part of that 2020 ordinance that I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but basically it states it's a rental of less than 30 consecutive days. That doesn't fall under some other accommodation such as hotel motel. So that was our definition. That was like number one thing we wanted to do in that ordinance. And then the next thing that we really wanted to do was differentiate between hosted and unhosted, which sometimes is called owner or owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. And that came about through a lot of public hearings that and just like, you know, just being on the street in North Elba and Lake Placid, you would hear from people like who there were the most staunch people who did not like short-term rentals. They'd say, but I don't have a problem with hosted short-term rentals, because the idea is that it's a person who is a full-time resident or most likely a full-time resident, and they're doing it just for like a little bit of extra income, but most importantly, they're there. And so there's none of that negative externality of noise or parking or anything like that. If it's your own home, like you're not allowing a party to happen in your own home or people to park on your yard. So we wanted to make sure that we really honored that and what we heard from the public. And so we had in that 2020 regulation, we had hosted. And so to be a hosted rental, you had to be the owner and you had to live on site for 184 days of the year. So you could be a snowbird who was coming back and forth, and you had to be, but you did have to be overnight when it was occupied. So you still had to be present when it was occupied as a short-term rental. And obviously, since it's hosted, most likely these were like our accessory dwelling units, you know, or like a cottage on the property. Sometimes they were just bedrooms. We've seen that fall kind of out of favor. So mostly they're little accessory dwelling units that are on their property. And then the unhosted rental was basically everything else. So, you know, a whole house rental that was, you know, an investor. Sometimes, you know, we did find that they weren't all investors. Sometimes like it was just like the neighbor who bought the house and wanted to short-term rental it. And so then trying to like make your neighbor a bad guy, you couldn't do it as easily as like a conglomeration that bought it for money. So, and I think, Mike, you brought that up in your intro that it's just like it's a very emotional topic. So like the more you can try to take the emotion out of it when you're trying to regulate it, I think is helpful by putting terms in like hosted and unhosted. And I know just trying to keep like really neutral terms. Or I always say like, someone will say like, well, the debate or the controversy over short-term rentals. And I'm like, how about the conversation over short-term rentals or the discussion over short-term rentals? Just so you're pulling it back to like these neutral terms, because it does get really emotional. And in that 2020, the one restrictive thing that we did do in the 2020 law was that we put a 90-day cap on all unhosted rentals. But if you were hosted or if you were in a gateway corridor, which essentially was like a mixed use corridor where you could have a hotel or motel anyway, then you didn't fall under that 90-day gap. So we tried to recognize that difference between hosted and also between something that would have been allowable in a commercial district as a hotel or motel, even though it was a short-term rental. And so they weren't held to that 90-day limit. And do you want me to go on to the next one, Mike, or do you want to jump to someone else? Oh, you're muted, but I think you said go on, but your hand motion said continue.
I'm sorry. Yes, please go on. Yes, please.
And then and so that was in 2020. And when we passed that in 2020, we had 10 people to agree, 5 village, 5 town. The majority agreed, but they said, we'll agree now because this is the easiest. It's health and safety, these like standard things that we're trying to get in place. We'll agree now, but you have to promise, meaning like the rest of the board and the volunteers that were part of this, that you will dive deeper into actually doing some restrictions, like to pull back on what has been like, you know, a free-for-all for 30 years in North Elba, because it has been going on in North Elba for quite a long time. And it didn't start with COVID by any means. And so we got stopped for a little bit by a lawsuit for about 2 years. And so we couldn't talk about anything for 2 years based on our attorney's advice. And then in 2022, the lawsuit went away. And so we started another volunteer working group looking at the 2020 ordinance and how it was working, where the pitfalls were, and also how we could start to make some more restrictions so that we were really trying very hard to protect neighborhoods and historic neighborhoods. And so the biggest like detail and restriction that comes from the 2023 ordinance. We also put a moratorium in place, which is one thing I wanted to mention. So we did put a moratorium on all new short-term rentals for, I think, almost 9 months, while this working group in 2022 was working out the details of what they wanted. So we said no more unhosted short-term rentals in 2 of our residential districts, which are called town residential and village residential. And the reason why those districts were chosen is that there are most high density zoning districts. So like houses are, you know, maybe 20 feet from each other. There's not a lot of parking. There's not a lot of yard. And basically you can hear your neighbor. And so if your neighbor is a short-term rental that's having a lot of people over, or just having like a fun Friday night, every Friday night, it's really impacting your quality of life. And that's also where the majority of our complaints and concerns were coming. Like this I forget what we always called it, like the nexus of short-term rental. And it was in these 2 neighborhoods. And so we said, okay, no more unhosted short-term rentals in those 2 neighborhoods as a way to help protect that vitality of like where the full-time population was living. And just to get away from these negative consequences of short-term rentals. And because there were other areas in North Elba where we thought they fit better. And so we said no more in there. We grandfathered the ones that were in there, but it doesn't transfer with property. So once that property is sold, it goes back to just a regular house. And then we also created a lodging STR permit, which recognized like the need for, again, in that gateway corridor, we had mixed use. Like if you could have a hotel and motel, but you chose to do short-term rentals, you weren't held to any caps or restrictions. And then also existing townhomes and condominiums, we gave that same exemption to, because HOAs are really good at regulating themselves. Like if you've ever been part of an HOA, you know you don't want to mess with them in general. And so we were like, if there's an active HOA in this townhome, we're going to let them have a lodging STR, not restrict them in any way. And that is actually, and the other thing too is that they weren't neighborhoods. Like these townhomes and condominiums were built as second homes or third homes or vacation rentals. So there was no neighbor, like people within those townhomes were not complaining about each other to the town. They were complaining to their HOA board, but not to the town board about, oh, I lost my neighborhood, or my neighbor's really bothering me. They were going to their HOA board. So we said, that's a great fit for where short-term rentals should go, along with these corridors. And then as an additional restriction, the town capped on hosted rentals at 165, not including lodging permits, and capped hosted permits at 48, not including lodging permits. So those were our big restrictions of 23. And that's been in place for 2 years, and I think is working very well in terms of finding a balance.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. That's a great overview. Peter, I saw you just jump off mute. Do you want to give us a bit more detail around your regulation? And really, it'd be great just to hear the process that your towns went through to enact and how things have evolved.
Sure. I think you're going to hear the programs at work. Like Emily mentioned, you have to differentiate between hosted and non-hosted, because those are 2 different animals. And your group, whether it's the planning board, select board, councilmen, the public, identify what your concerns are first. So what are your concerns and what are you trying to steer away from? So identify, as Emily was saying, in New York, you might have areas, depending on your zoning, that really are appropriate and short-term rentals would be embraced. So you don't need to do so much regulation there. I'm more of a believer in the less regulation you can have, the better off you are for a lot of reasons. plus it minimizes lawsuits. If you have that concern, and in Gorham, it was out-of-state speculators taking our residential neighborhoods and turning them into kind of de facto Motel 6s. And there's a lot of kind of secondary, tertiary community benefits to having neighborhoods and things you'll hear about. And if you're on this, you know some of the inconveniences of short-term rentals, the parking issue, the traffic issue. Every night is Saturday night, whether it's Tuesday night or Wednesday night or Thursday night, and it can really destroy the fabric and character of a residential area. So we wanted to really minimize that, and through this process of public hearings and due diligence, we came up with this 120-day hosted or non-hosted. But boy, people are tricky. And if you talk about hosting, it was brought up. We were thinking accessory dwelling units or the old in-law apartment. That makes sense. Well, what if somebody has 5 acres and they start putting up little tiny homes or yurts? And now are they really? So you have to be prepared to have an ongoing evolution with these. And as we know too, the market is changing. So as the market changes, you might need to be able to, or need to tweak what you're doing with your regulations. And again, I'll point out the focus should be, whether it's intentional or not, as a practical means, fire, health, and safety is the angle you want to go at. And for us, it made a lot of sense, right? It made a lot of sense. And when you talk with the property owners, you're saying, let us help you, because you don't want to have this accessory dwelling unit that you just put electricity in with a bunch of extension cords. And you think now you're going to be making an extra thousands a month. What you've done is set up a fire trap, and your insurance might not cover you. And if you're operating under the radar of the ordinances, you're now operating an illegal, out of code fire trap. How do you think that's going to go for you? And then people would say, thank you. And make sure that your code enforcement officers have the attitude of, we're here to help and help you navigate through the process as best they can. So that went a long way here in Gorham. I mentioned we only have about 2,700 residents, but there's 10 to 15,000 people a day who come through. And when you put in the hundreds of hotel rooms and then the higher capacity short-term rentals, we're actually a community that's closer to 3,500. So we bat a little bit above our weight, and we're trying to, again, take into consideration how to best regulate these short-term rentals so we don't have those side effects that we don't want, that we identified. For us, we're kind of where Emily's going. We have a commercial zone, a mixed-use zone, and short-term rentals are not directly regulated under our current ordinance, because short-term rentals are really tourist accommodations within that zoning. So we'll be updating to require those tourist accommodations less than 30 days, that if they were in a residential area would be a short-term rental, but because they're in a mixed zone, they're kind of in the middle. We're going to require them to have a health and safety check as well. And perhaps even for the hotels, though hotels are fairly well regulated by the state of New Hampshire, so we might not have to go that far. So there's a little bit more info and background of what we're doing here in Gorham.
Thanks, Peter. Mike Harris, go for it.
Yeah, hi. So in the town of Burke, I believe, like Emily in North Elba is considerably further ahead within their regulations and ordinance as far as regulating. Same thing with Peter from Gorham. Ours, we pretty much just adopted a basic, simple rental registration ordinance for the number of reasons I had indicated, and as Peter has touched on as well, for the health and safety, and I think as Emily had indicated too, even just going through the permit process, part of that permit process requires you to notify your abutters, so all your neighbors are aware of what the activity is going to be and what is going on there. It just gives us basic information, basic guidelines, and kind of helps us kind of help the property owners again stay in compliance. Just touching on those issues, but we have not gone to the next level in terms of getting into the actually regulating, how many days a year you may have short-term rental capabilities, exactly where those are located right now in our town. It's considered an accessory use, which is allowed in every district, from the villages out to the outskirts of town. And so the intent of our ordinance was simply just to get something in place, just to have some regulation, a basic regulation on it. Part of the other thing with ours, when we did do the rental registration ordinance, it was a kind of a slow rollout. So our population base is about 1,800 people spread over, as I said, West Burke, Burke Hollow, and East Burke. And then it swells up, same as with Gorham, it does swell up periodically throughout the year. So what we've been trying to do is just basically put these guidelines in place, keeping in mind that when we did the rental registration ordinance, first thing is everybody worries about, well, everybody's going to come in tomorrow to register, which would be, we're looking at just conservatively, we probably have at least 400 to 500 units of rental units within our town, within the community. And we're not set up to handle 500 people showing up the next day to be able to process that kind of volume. So what we did was we knew we were just going to slowly roll this out. We advertise it, we discuss it at most select board meetings, the development and review board meetings, and it's publicized in the town report, as well as periodically reported on in the papers, which, so what I've seen probably in the last, specifically in the last year, we've seen an uptick in permit applications. And now we generally review anywhere between 1 and 8 permits per month with a development review board specifically for the rental registration. So it's not like once we put this into effect, I started going door to door requesting people to register. That wasn't really the point, at least right now. It was basically just a slow rollout, a long-term approach. We had this ordinance in place. We could better educate people as we went along, and when most people are pretty sophisticated in that when they come in, they understand why they need to they do need to register, why they do need to go through the permit process. So to those of you out there some of your towns that maybe are like the size of Berks, if you're going to entertain doing this, I would suggest doing as Emily has done, and I'm sure in both Peter's and in the town of Berks case, that we simply started off with a basic rental registration ordinance, kind of put the infrastructure in place to be able to administer those rental registrations, not so as not to overwhelm either the town clerk's office, which they would be less than impressed with having all of a sudden an enormous workload and not, knowing what to deal with. And the same thing with our board, because again, we're all a volunteer community. I mean, everybody, I'm paid part-time. We have a lot of volunteers. So the idea was basically to get some basic information without overwhelming our admin system. And unlike some of the larger communities, we don't to do the enforcement, quote unquote enforcement. Well, that costs money. That costs money because it costs time, and you have to hire people to do that. So we kind of our approach again was a long-term approach to basically put the infrastructure in place to make sure that this actually did work and that we were getting the information that we were looking for out of this. Slowly over time, I would say over the next couple of years, we will have our compliance well underway as far as the rental registration. And then at that point, because I noticed there was a question in one of the Q&A boxes about the legal ramifications, any lawsuits. One of the things that we did realize early on was, to put in a rental registration, there has to be a need, and you have to identify what that need is to be able to justify what it is that you're doing. Otherwise, you are going to end up in a lawsuit. Somebody will sue the town for sure. And then beyond that, when you start implementing regulations, it's really starting putting specific regulations in place. You have to have a basis of information to base all of that off from. Otherwise, you will find yourself in lawsuit, and more than likely will probably lose it without having the information backing up what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So to those of you out there that are, like I said, are in the smaller towns or considering doing something like this, basically when I started seeing this, I approached the planning commission. Our town is set up where we have the select board, we have the planning commission, development review board, and the zoning administrator. And the planning commission basically are the ones that are in charge with drafting the rules and regulations for the zoning bylaws. As well as drafting ordinances for the select board to do this. And we felt that the easiest way to go about it would be to develop the ordinance as opposed to trying to draft and put something in with the zoning bylaw or the zoning regulations. And so, what people tend to do is they go to the select board and say, okay, we have this problem, we want you guys to fix it. Well, they're not really the ones that are going to develop ordinances per se. Really, the planning commission is where you really want to start with and to have those discussions and those public meetings with to try to draft those rules and regulations and then present those to the select board for their adoption when it comes to the ordinances.
I just wanted to jump in quickly and with Mike, you made some great points, and you see the diversity among these communities. Whenever you talk about money, the risk of a lawsuit starts to go up. So if you're talking about fees, if you don't have a fee, you won't get in trouble. If you said our town wants to generate money off this and charge $2,000 for a short-term rental, you're going to get sued, right? If you charge $25, you won't. I would recommend trying to cover your administrative costs and not look at permits and fees for short-term rentals as a new revenue stream, even though that might be attractive to some people. You don't want to go too far off that, because then it's more money and then you'll probably more likely, and it's harder to justify. When you're saying we hired a part-time code enforcement and it costs this much, it's much easier to get that to pass muster.
I was just going to say, to jump in, like you have costs, like you have the cost of a software system that could be up to $25,000 a year, and you have code inspectors. So, I mean, our permits are in that range, and that's not why we were sued.
Well, because you can justify that, right? You can justify that.
Justified it.
I want to give
just to give an example, when we started discussing putting our ordinance together, we had some very ambitious folks on the planning commission, and that when we started talking about fees, I mean, when we started, there was like $4,000 per unit. Well, we're going to make them pay. Well, wasn't really the point of the ordinance. And to what Peter was saying, my suggestion, particularly because we're not on the same scale as say North Elba is, but we felt that if we simply said, well, we'll just do this voluntary. Well, it's not going to be you're going to have a tough time having people do that if there's no fee attached to it. However, we didn't want to go to the extreme of $4,000 per unit. And so we settled in at 45. There were some that varied, like I know Franconia, New Hampshire is at 200 a year per unit for their rental registration. And even that was we felt was a little bit excessive. So my feeling was, and the board's feeling was that, we needed to keep it reasonable, that, the intent wasn't to create a department of enforcement, was basically just to kind of, to give some seriousness to it and to help defray some of the costs anyways.
Cool. Thank you, Mike.
Mhm.
Peter Jameson, I know Millinocket is kind of the new kid on the block with regulation. You want to talk a little bit about your reg and the process you all have gone through and where you're at?
Absolutely. I hear, stories of concern from community members, from neighborhood impact. I can say here that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, yeah, we did see some complaints along the way, excess noise, that sort of stuff, but they were very few. The cool thing about it was the lifestyle of the people who live here is the reason why people are visiting here, right? So they're coming here to go snowmobiling, they're coming here to go ATVing, they're coming here to go mountain biking and fishing and hiking. So we didn't really see a whole lot of that because the neighboring properties were also getting up and used to the noise of revving up a snowmobile at 6 a.m. to hit the trails. The flip side of that is the odd, the community members that were upset that we were talking about short-term rentals and their regulation were because the community saw it as a way of hindering business, hindering economic development, hindering housing market positive impact. And the more we, since I took this role 3 years ago, our focus has been on steady, open and transparent communication with our citizens. We've invested some money. We've hired somebody specific. Well, part of their role is specifically based on communication with the public. The more we instilled in our messaging that hey, we're not trying to take this away or cap it. We just want to know where they are and who to call in the case of an emergency, and make sure that visitors to our town were staying in safe accommodations. And I think at its height, we were probably north of 150 in Millinocket proper, which is a pretty big chunk of our housing stock here. I mean, it's a overall small percentage, but when you're looking at people wanting to move here with no real room for expansion, we're kind of an island in the middle of the woods. A lot of people, organizations refer to us as that. We're an island in the middle of the woods, and all of the land surrounding us is owned by either the state of Maine or forestry and logging operations and private ownership. So there's no room to grow. What we have seen, though, with the increase in housing values or house values and a market that got really saturated really quickly, we're seeing less and less Airbnbs already. The last number I saw just from looking at looking at the websites were about 70. So that's dropped about in half, or better. And some of those are duplicates from the, you know, the two major sites. We are we're we're about a month and a half into having a live ordinance. That's why I say the most important thing when you're looking to do this is to have consistency in the drive, consistency in the leadership, to not start and then hand it off to somebody else. Somebody has to drive that train until you get there. We did that. We did include what we feel is a nominal fee. It's $100 for the registration and $100 annual for renewal. The idea behind that is exactly what you know, the others had mentioned. It is a toll on our code enforcement office, and the property inspections require time, you know, the you know, all of the related work. So we're looking at that not as a profit, but as a way to offset some of the additional workload that this is causing. And, you know, if you look at our ordinance, it's mostly based off of, you know, almost the entire criteria in it is around life safety code and proof of insurance and having the inspection but it's the only cap we have is that, you know, a short-term rental is anything that's rented out for less than 30 days at a time. No neighborhoods are capped right now. We went into this, it was passed in February of this year. We went into it with the intention of using the first year to collect data. You know, get as many registered as we could, understand, you know, like a heat map of where they are and whether or not we need to revise the ordinance in a year or two. You know, should the necessity of amendments be identified.
Great, thanks, Peter. One question I had for all of you, and I see that we have some interest from our audience as well, is around the topic of enforcement and monitoring. So I wanted to see if the panel would be willing to speak to, yeah, just what processes you've enacted, tools you're using, and if there are teeth to your regulation, so to speak.
I can jump in quickly. You're going to see a variety, which is good. There's lots of ways to enforce. I would recommend not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. You're not going to catch every short-term rental. Here in Gorham, we have staff in our assessing office. You know, people can self-report, but we actively go out and look at the short-term rental websites. Of course, there's going to be a loophole if people are doing this kind of under the radar with friends and family or past renters and they're not going through a site. It's harder to find, but the short-term rental sites are a start. Enforcement, we start with, you know, friendly reminders, and then we've gone a couple times to court and issued $1,000 and this was like the fourth step in the process, but it starts off progressively from verbal to a nice letter, reminder letter, and then it goes to enforcement through the select board. And, you know, where you don't get a permit, and two, you'll get a court fee up to $1,000. So that's Gorham.
Thanks, Peter.
In Burke, as I said before, we're I wouldn't say we're aggressively going after people, but typically in our area, because I know everybody in town, I know what everybody, you know, you kind of get a gist of the area that whatever your area is, you know, and you hear different things. And a lot of things that I find is either opportunity generally presents itself. And so somebody comes in for a permit, number one, or if somebody transact that property, or if there's an issue, something comes up. It kind of prompts, you know, well, did they come in? Are they registered? Did they register their rental unit or not? And then, as Peter had said, we'll send out letters occasionally, just reminding people. And at this point, that's just basically what we're doing, is just kind of reminding people they do need to register their rental units. A lot of times, like I said, opportunity tends to present itself. So the idea of going out aggressively to do the enforcement is, I don't want to be any more intrusive than I need to be, because I don't want to treat somebody like that, because that's not how I would want to be treated. So so whenever you hear enforcement, you always instantly think of something very negative happening. And typically those things, I usually put it onto that person. So if they don't want to comply and they refuse to comply, it's on them squarely. And I'm not trying to beat them down with it. But there are enough parameters set in place where sooner or later, whether they want to or not, they will have to come into compliance, whether that's just circumstances, those things happen.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mike. Emily.
I would recommend for people starting out, even though it is an expense, but it's an expense, I think, based on the number of parcels you have, is buying a software system. So right now, the town of North Elba uses Cloud Permit, but before that, we probably had 3 or 4 iterations of some sort of software system. And like Peter said, like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because they all overpromise and underdeliver. But what they are good at is, like, if you don't have the staff, but you can pay maybe $15,000, because I really think ours was so expensive because we had so many parcels. We have 553 permits and 8,000 parcels, so it's like 10%. Ever since the very beginning, our permitting system has been online, which I also think is very helpful, because short-term rentals, it's like an online kind of thing, right? Airbnb, VRBO, everything's being done online, so they're used to it. It just makes sense. And so all those platforms have online permitting systems, and so they get their permit, they do the application online from wherever they are. They make sure it's very clear about what the requirements are. But then the other package that you can buy onto with all of those is a scrubbing, like, compliance component, but you don't have to. You can just buy the permitting software, which is obviously cheaper, but you can buy a compliance package. And the compliance package scrubs all the sites for you. You usually it picks like it picks like 4 national or international sites. I think Turnkey is another, or Flipkey is another one. And then some of them let you pick local sites. So because we have so many realtors in town, we got to add like our own realtor, like Merrill Thomas Real Estate. They were scrubbing Merrill Thomas. Like, we had 4 or 5 of our local real estate agents so they were doing all of that scrubbing for us. And it was helpful in the very beginning, because they helped us, like, quickly gather a bunch of people that weren't in compliance. And they would also send the letters, and it was a polite letter. It was like a screenshot of their listing, and just said, we see that you don't have a short-term rental permit, like, please follow these instructions, no fines. We always say that we would rather have people come into compliance than fine them, because that's obviously the path of least resistance. And so in the beginning, that software system was super helpful for us, but then we got to a point that we had someone in our office that was a much better scrubber than and also most of them are registered, right? So you're just like looking for those oddballs that are out there, like something new that popped up. And so we ended up moving over to a system where we drop the compliance, still online permitting, but we pay someone within our office to be like a real live scrubber who goes through and looks for listings that don't have permits. The enforcement on and there's like the big part of enforcement is, like, what if they still don't listen, or like what if they were violating the biggest why we dropped the day limitations is that was our biggest thing that we couldn't, and I know Peter's still using that, and that's obviously working for you, but we had so many problems with trying to enforce day limits. So the software system we were using at that time, I think, was Host Compliance. And so Host Compliance told us, we can track the number of days, like, not a problem. We can tell you when someone's reached their 90-day limit. And so we get a notification, the building office would get a notification to say, like, 16 Acorn Street has reached their 90-day limit. They're now at 91. And we'd reach out to 16 Acorn, and they would say, oh no, I blocked those days off in Airbnb or VRBO because my family was there, or because my nephew was there. Like, they had all these excuses, and that software system couldn't delineate between what was rental paid and what was blocked by the host, which was a huge pitfall. Like, if you can't tell me that, then you can't tell me that they're meeting the maximum number of days. And so that's when we were sent through with them. But no one can do that yet. But I guarantee that was like 2 or 3 years ago. So it's like they're always changing, they're always buying each other up, and they always offer new packages. So maybe one of them can actually do that now if you really want to do the day limit thing. But they couldn't tell us when it was being blocked out by the owner and when it was being rented. So then we were like, well, this is pointless. And then we also had a neighbor who actually counted and wrote down the license plates of every time she saw an out-of-state license plate in the driveway. And so they came to us and said, this is more than 90 days. So we did actually bring it to the owner, and the owner again said, well, that was when my grandparents were there, my parents were there, and like was able to write off like half of the things by saying that it wasn't actually an exchange of cash. It was just a friend or family staying there. So, I mean, the number of days thing is just a huge, that part of enforcement was so difficult for us. And so we just dropped that in the end.
Thanks, Emily. Peter Gagnon, you teased this, and I want to get to this topic. Something that living here in Glen, New Hampshire, in the Mount Washington Valley, we've seen a couple of cases of lawsuits that have come about as a result of regulation. One that was found in favor of the zoning, the
Property owners.
Metro District town. The other one didn't. I'm curious to hear your experience and others as well with lawsuits and how that's all kind of gone for you.
Well, again, nobody should be reinventing the wheel, and you can learn from other people's positive and negative experiences. So we looked around at that, and I'm not going to cast stones. And as you're seeing with this panel, there's different things that can work. The communities that got in trouble were the ones who maybe didn't reach out and get that community input, and they thought they had a great idea, and we don't like short-term rentals. I think we all have to accept that short-term rentals are going to happen one way or another. So what is the best way to contain them or keep them from going totally off track? There are some communities like Peter's talking about in Millinocket where it's a virtual non-issue. They're welcome with open arms, and the more the better. There's other communities that you're talking about, Mike, that really it's a crisis for affordable housing and resident housing, and it became a very emotional issue. I would say that things got very emotional and people stopped thinking because short-term rentals, again, we talk about that magical money thing. So if I'm looking at renting out my property for tens of thousands of dollars a year, and then the town says that you can't do that no more, that's going to cause a problem. So I don't recommend people jumping ahead and saying, we're going to stop short-term rentals. It's, again, more of a health and safety fire. We're helping out property owners. And what I've seen anecdotally, and I don't know if, Mike or Peter or Emily have seen this, it has slowed down a little bit because the short-term rental market isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Just like any rental market, you're now paying people to flip over. Does the property owner want to spend every weekend doing laundry? So you're going to hire somebody, and who is that person going to be? And then all it takes is one or two bad tenants or the police showing up, and then your profits kind of evaporate. So when I look at the other towns around us, I would say that those communities maybe jumped ahead a little bit of where they should have, didn't consult with legal counsel, didn't have enough public input. And what they did was maybe a little bit simplistic or naive and or heavy-handed. And now they've dug a hole and they really couldn't. I think we got three or four different examples of great regulations that are kind of working. Those communities that have gotten beaten up in lawsuits, the community itself probably wouldn't accept anything now because they've gone through this traumatic experience, and it's kind of a mess. So don't do that.
But to be clear, you've weathered a few and successfully, correct, in Gorham?
Yeah, we had an out-of-state speculative person spend over $1 million for a property that was assessed for 600. So basically spent double for it. He didn't do his due diligence. And to Emily's point, our goal for the cap wasn't directly to be accurate. It was to keep out the professional, speculative, short-term rental folks. Now, if they come in bent on operating illegally, I mean, there's a word for that. I don't know, you know, criminals. I don't know what you call it, but most ethical business people don't want to violate ordinances. And if you go to a bank and you say, I'm going to monetize this property, that's why I want $1 million loan, the bank will say the local ordinances don't match up with your plan, so you don't get to finance that house at that property. We had a cash buyer. We pushed back. We didn't let him rent, and there was a septic system issue. He didn't make the money he thought he would. He then tried to sue us, and it became kind of a nothing burger because our ordinances held up, and he was suing us over an abatement issue. So it was actually kind of a tangential property valuation. And so that worked out all right. And I did mention we had some enforcement actions, but those were only 2. And those were really based on just health and safety, where people were operating just an unsafe attached dwelling unit and they wouldn't come into compliance. And that's what kind of led us to, it wasn't over, you went over your days or you didn't pay your permit fee. It was they were operating in an unsafe condition. So that's kind of where that legal part went. And it's not because I'm a lawyer that we're always going to court. I just want to say that.
Yeah. Thanks for that rundown.
Yeah.
Open to anybody else who wants to jump in there, but we'll also, I think we're at a point where we can dive into some audience questions. So I want to, I got one from here from Leslie Carrison, one of our very own Northern Forest Center staff over in the Adirondacks. She's curious to hear from particularly Peter and Emily, Peter Gagnon, I believe. She notes that sometimes she hears communities described as not needing STR regulations. And she's curious if you all have advice that you would offer for communities that don't feel pressure from STRs as much. Would you recommend getting out in front of the demand or sit back and wait?
Emily,
And
I bet you we're going to have the same answer. I'll let you go ahead.
yeah, Emily, go for it, please.
Yeah, so in my intro, I mentioned something about like it's becoming like a rising to an issue in the late 90s to 2000s. And like everyone let it go until 2017. And so, and then in 2017, so much of like what was being said was like the cart's already the horse, you can't do anything. Like there was so much pushback against that. And it was kind of like, watch us, like we're going to try to do something. But if in 2000, when it was becoming an issue, if we just would have done something so simple as like a registration process, you wouldn't have had those battles. And then again, like you'd be building it up. And also you wouldn't have so much speculative investment that then opened yourself up for lawsuits because people were buying properties that were way overpriced based on a speculation of what they could make of it. So even if, and I do talk to a lot of communities where it's like a mixed board, 2 of the board members think it's necessary, 3 of them don't. And so I'm always, that's always my pitch is like, you have to start somewhere. And even if you're not feeling that major pressure right now, why not start with the registration process? Just know where they are. And I think that's what the other Peter was saying is like, we just wanted to get like a pulse of where they were and just kind of be able to track them. And at some point when you see like, oh my gosh, there's a lot in this neighborhood and we're hearing a lot of complaints from this neighborhood, then maybe you start to think about adding on to what you did. But I think a simple registration process for health and safety reasons and for data reasons, it's like you always want information, and the more information you have, the better.
I agree. I just said it ends up tweaking. In New Hampshire, there's real estate valuations. So what you end up having is a normal residential property that's a quarter, 250,000. But if you look at it as a short-term rental property, now it's easily 450, 500,000. It can mess up your property values, and people are saying, why did my valuation jump up? Well, because in your neighborhood, there's 3 or 4 short-term rentals that sold for double the assessed value. So congratulations, your value has now gone up as well. So what Emily said, I think is right on point. Peter and Mike have really great kind of level 1 or, preliminary, I would suggest having that in place. It's better to have it and not need it, because if you need it and you don't have it, then the horse is already out of the barn and all those other cliches kick in.
The one
And
thing
then
that
you're in a
was
bad place.
The one thing that was also great about short-term rental version law number 1 was that people could see, like smart people and investors, like, they're businessmen, they can see the writing on the wall. And if you read the writing on the wall, you knew where to invest. You knew that it was in a gateway corridor. You knew that it was in a townhome or a condo. Like if you really wanted a short-term rental that you didn't think was going to be under some sort of restriction, you could kind of see where that law was going, and you could make adequate decisions that weren't so speculative. Like, don't buy a house in the single family home in a neighborhood, buy the townhome, buy the mixed use property on Main Street. Like it kind of helped people become accustomed to of like what might be coming.
Yeah,
Peter Jameson.
it's always better to be proactive than reactive, it's always, that's the safer route. Had Millinocket been, ahead of that game, even with a simple registration, the headache of the following 4 or 5 years would have been so much easier, hindsight being what it is. And what Emily was describing is exactly why, I mean, it was a fire sale here. We didn't know anything about this stuff. We knew that we've got a lot of lakes, so we've got a lot of waterfront stuff, just north of us. And some of those were, kind of off market, seasonal rentals. But 2020, COVID, the people that were already in the game, I mean, word traveled fast, that it was no holds barred here, and the housing stock was cheap. So looking back, it was more of a, not quite a flash in the pan, but it definitely was saturated quickly and has brought itself back. And hesitation or frustration by short-term rental property owners is really just met with, our administration is pretty laid back around here, and our code enforcement officer that enforces this stuff, he was our fire chief. He's worked for the town for 50 years. His entire life goal is health and safety and helping people. So, those that come and hear the rumors, we advise them, hey, we'll come take a look. We're not going to fine you right away. We're not, none of that. We'll just let you know what you need to fix, and we'll give you the time to fix it. And you'll pay us a fee because that's going to offset the cost of the additional work. But even if you have nothing, and there's even a possibility of somebody wanting to come to your town, a few weekends a year or however often, at least start with a registration and a simple ordinance, so you're not being reactive in an emergency situation.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Good advice from everybody. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
And I'd also add to that too, is a lot of folks take a look at your town zoning bylaws, if you have zoning bylaws, and really study them, look through those, because a lot of that, like in our town, accessory use, for instance, is allowed in every district, and some towns may not have that in certain districts within their town. So take a look at that, and when you're developing your ordinance, and kind of develop the ordinance around that. The only other thing I'd mention to a lot of folks, that if you're considering it, I would consider it, just, if nothing else, just consider this. So most people, they go in, like I used to, like I said, we have a resort town, so Burke Mountain Resort. And back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was a certain amount of condo development, a lot of things that go in. So typically in those commercial applications, they'll do the initial plumbing, electrical, and fire safety inspections and they pass and everything is gone. I kept thinking, well, of course they do this every year. Well, they don't inspect those every year. So in some cases, we have condos up there that haven't had fire inspections for well over 20 plus years anyways. And so part of this rental registration ordinance requires somebody to actually sign off on the fact that their smoke detectors, that they do meet the required standards and codes for fire and safety. And it's a yearly reminder of that, and they have to sign off on that as well. So they have to accept responsibility for that. Whereas for so many, there's been some cases up there, and I know well over 30 years, well, the standards and requirements, particularly with the Department of Fire and Safety, change over those years. And we have some extreme cases where people have developed and made bedrooms where there's no egress whatsoever. There's been some modifications to buildings that are completely illegal. And it really helps to kind of remind people that they do have to, there are rules and laws that they do have to follow, and they should be mindful of that. And I also mentioned the fact that someone coming up and renting, they're paying good money, and they walk in just like any of us here. We walk into a hotel, we never question whether they have the proper inspections, the proper permitting, or proper anything, because we assume it's already done. In and I would say a lot of cases, but in some cases, none of that's done. And we have people that are Airbnb renting out houses that are not necessarily safe. Not that it's a rampant problem, but it still exists there. And this is just one more tool to kind of help protect people.
Yeah,
Thanks,
to
Mike.
that
I want to
point,
go
Mike,
ahead, Peter.
thank you, Mike Moore. I'll be very brief. One of the arguments that we were receiving throughout the public hearing process for the ordinance was, from short-term rental owners saying that in order to list my property on Airbnb, it has to be inspected. I'm responsible for that. The reality of that is you're checking a box on a computer screen, and you're not having someone come to your house and inspect to sign off on whether your property meets life safety codes, has egress, the electrical work, the heating sources, everything, because you can check a box, but to Peter Morin's point, you can be honest or dishonest at that point in time. And pass your inspection on the website, but it may not be true. So it's really important to put the effort into that registration and inspection process for the safety of your community and the visitors.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Another question from our audience. This is a resident over in Mountain Desert Island. They note that about 50% of their housing stock on the island is vacant and used for lodging. They just, as to paraphrase, they've seen challenges with affordable housing, being able to have enough housing to accommodate workforce for like the local hospital and other businesses and organizations in the island. They're curious if you all have thoughts about how you strike the right balance of having STRs and just standard residential units.
I don't know. I think each community is unique. So every answer is going to be unique depending on your situation. If you have if you're a mill town and people all pulled out, maybe you don't have to worry about it as much. But on Mount Desert Island, you're literally an island. So it depends how much of a heavy hand the local government wants to put in to try to create that housing. I know a lot of businesses in the Mount Washington Valley area have taken it on that they will, as an ancillary part of their business, provide housing for staff and workers. So, that could be one piece, but I don't know if there's It's like, how do you enforce speeding in your town? Do you tell the police chief, catch everybody going 5 miles an hour over, or is it more like if they're driving dangerously? So I don't know if I have a good answer.
One place to start with that answer is if you've ever commissioned a housing needs assessment. So that is one thing that North Elba did in 2020. So it basically looked at all of our existing housing stock and what the price points were, and then looked at all of our jobs that we had and whether those matched up. And so through that housing needs assessment, our goal was to reach that 50% of our workers actually lived in North Elba. So right now, we've gotten better. But by the time the study was done, I think it was around 35. But even like 10 years ago, it was closer to like 55. So we had lost a lot of that people were driving in because there was no more affordable housing in North Elba. And so that housing study, that was the mission. So they gave us like a bunch of points of like, you need to have X amount of housing in order to reach 50% of your work staff living here. And so that was some helpful data to have for a lot of reasons, not just short-term rental. It actually spurred some private development because developers saw that and saw, oh my gosh, there's this wonderful need for housing up to 200% of my AMI for home ownership. And so it was a base point of a conversation piece, and also it spurred some private development based on that data.
Thanks, Emily. We have a couple minutes, then we're going to have to wrap up, but I want to try to get to a couple more of these questions. One of them relates to individual property covenants, deed restrictions, being, landowners, property owners, putting in specific, language related to, let's see, the example is my 70-year-old neighbor in Bethel added a covenant to her estate document saying first right of refusal is for community members before open market sale. I'm curious if any of you are familiar or seen that being enacted in any of your communities from residents.
I have not, but I love that, and I seriously appreciate sharing that. Our local population is, nearly 50% or more, older adults, 65, 70 or older. And, we're seeing that transition happen now between generations and those properties changing hands, and that's a really good idea to start sharing with some of our local folks.
Peter Gagnon, briefly.
Just quickly, again, this is a lawyer, I would say no. You can put in whatever you want, but the courts are not going to enforce that. Who's going to bring a lawsuit? You're restricting the free market. They call it kind of hand from the grave. My land can only be sold to married couples. My land can only be sold to married couples who go to a good Christian church. My land can only be sold to somebody from French background. They're all well-intentioned and maybe, but it's not enforceable. So you would need a state legislative change. You'd need an RSA that would allow that, kind of like a reverse homesteading. So that's the way to do that. But on and of itself, that would be really, they can do it, but it's not really enforceable.
Peter, I would suggest that you look at Vail and Deed. Have you ever heard of that program in Colorado? It's kind of a similar program, but it's a different state. And so it doesn't really fly in New York State. And I know Old Forge was trying to do it, but as far as I know, they have not closed on one property. But the idea is that there would be an organization that was making sure the deed restriction was followed, and they would have legal fees. Like, they would collect legal fees to be able to defend that if it wasn't, but someone would be watching it to make sure that that deed restriction was actually enforced. And obviously it can't be against a protected class, right? Like you can't so AMI is not a protected class, or residency is generally not a protected class. So Vail and Deed, and Leslie can probably drop in the name of the one in Old Forge, but those are some good examples to look at. And then my other thing was along the same lines of who's going to sue you. So we would have numerous people before we had registered, before even now, like they're like, look at my deed. It says my neighbor can't have a short-term rental. My neighbor has a short-term rental. And we were like, well, you can sue your neighbor, but we're not going to do anything about that. So like the town is not going to get involved in private deed restrictions.
Cool. Thank you all. We do need to wrap up, Mike. I'm gonna cut you
Go
off. I'm sorry. I appreciate the lively discussion today. You all have been great. I do want to say thank you to the USDA and Rural Development for funding and supporting the series. Also, thank you all that attended the webinar today to view it and ask good questions. I really appreciate everyone's participation. We would love feedback from you all that were in attendance. We'll be dropping into the chat a link to our feedback form. You'll also receive a follow-up email, including a link to the evaluation, as well as a recording to the webinar. So there's a lot of good details that were shared today, and I'm sure folks may want to go back through and maybe hone in on some of the notes that were shared by our great panelists. I do want to note that our next webinar in the series will be Sustaining the Path, Trail Improvements for a Climate Resilient Future. It will be a panel discussion on successful trail improvements in Vermont focused on climate resiliency and erosion mitigation. Keep an eye out for the date and registration link in the next couple of weeks. We'll be sending that out. And if you haven't already, you can sign up for our email news digest to learn more about future webinars, other Northern Forest Center updates, and general news from throughout the region. You can even select a geographic or thematic focus so that you only get the updates related to your interest, which is a pretty cool little feature. The link to the sign up page should be showing up in your chat soon, if not already. And lastly, if you've been enjoying this webinar and others in our series and want to support this vital work and the broader work of the Northern Forest Center in building the new forest future, please consider donating. A link to our donation page can be found on our website and should be popping up in the chat. So with that, I'd like to thank you all, our panelists, one last time. Thank you for a great and lively conversation. You all are awesome. And thank you for joining. And have a nice afternoon, everybody.